I am 76 years old, and most mornings I wake up earlier than I would like. Not because I am restless or full of energy, but because the silence of this villa by the Florida coast presses against me in a way that makes sleep impossible. When my wife was alive, the mornings had a rhythm to them, a sequence of quiet rituals that bound the day together. The smell of toast, the sound of her humming while she watered the plants on the veranda, the little arguments about whether the newspaper should be read from the headlines first or from the crossword puzzle page. Those small things have disappeared, and though the house is large and spacious, it feels like a hollow shell echoing with the traces of a life that used to be. I never remarried after my wife passed. I told myself it was because no one could replace her, but in truth, I think I became afraid of trying to start again, of discovering that my best years were already behind me. This villa, this house by the sea with its long windows and tall palms leaning toward the water, became the only constant I had left, and so I clung to it as if it were my second skin. The place itself has a history that is tangled with mine. I bought this land almost 50 years ago, when Florida was not yet choked by so many resorts and retirement communities, when the coastline was still raw and filled with open stretches of beach that you could walk along for hours without meeting a soul. I had just returned from service and had saved enough from working long hours in construction to consider settling down somewhere permanent. Most men my age were still renting or living in cramped starter homes, but I had a different idea. I wanted a place that would last not only my lifetime, but would also be a legacy, a sign to my children and their children that our family could build something enduring. My wife, Anna, was doubtful at first. She thought the land was too isolated, too wild, too impractical. Yet when we stood together on the sand one evening and watched the sky burn orange over the horizon, she squeezed my hand and said she could imagine growing old here. That was enough for me. Brick by brick, month by month, I oversaw the building of this villa, putting more of myself into it than into any other endeavor in my life. It was not just a house, but a monument to our marriage, to our stubborn dream that we could create a life of permanence in a world that seemed always ready to take things away. Over the years, this house saw everything. The laughter of birthday parties when my son, Daniel, was still small and liked to run through the hallways pretending he was a pirate captain. The quiet dinners after long days of work when I would come home to find Anna waiting with a meal and a glass of wine. The storms that rattled the shutters and made us sit close together, listening to the rain pounding against the glass as if the ocean itself wanted to come inside. The villa was where Daniel took his first steps, where he brought home his first report cards, where he introduced his high school friends who trampled sand into the living room carpet. It was also where we comforted him through his first heartbreak, where we gave him advice about college, where we told him that no matter what path he chose, he would always have a home to return to. All of that history is written into the walls of this place, and whenever I walk through it now, alone, I can almost hear those echoes, though they have grown faint and sometimes cruel in their reminders of what has slipped away. As the years advanced and Anna's health began to falter, the house became more than just our shelter. It was her sanctuary, the place where she wanted to spend her last days. She told me once, in a rare moment of vulnerability, that she would rather die here in the bedroom where she had laughed and cried with me for decades than in a sterile hospital surrounded by machines. And when the time came, I honored that wish. She passed away quietly one early morning, the curtains billowing with a sea breeze, her hand still loosely clutching mine. Since then, every room has carried her absence like a wound that will not heal. The kitchen smells too clean because she is no longer there to scatter flour while baking. The garden looks too neat because her chaotic joy in planting anything and everything is missing. The bed is too large because no one lies on the other side. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I still reach across instinctively, only to touch the cold sheet, and I realize all over again that I am alone. My son is the only close family I have left. Daniel is 46 now, a man with his own life, his own ambitions, his own household. For many years I believed we were close. I tried to raise him with the values my own father instilled in me. Hard work, honesty, loyalty to family above all. I wanted him to inherit not only my property but also my principles. But as he grew older, I began to notice how he slipped further and further away, how his calls grew less frequent, his visits more formal, his tone when he spoke to me increasingly distant, as if he were talking to a stranger he was obliged to respect but not to love. He married a woman named Madeline about 15 years ago, and from the first day I sensed a wall between us. She was polite enough, even charming at times, but she carried herself with the assurance of someone who thought she knew better than those who came before her. Her parents were well off, not wealthy enough to live in true luxury but comfortable, and I could see how Daniel admired them, how he seemed to lean more toward their way of living than toward the traditions he grew up with in this villa. I do not blame him entirely. Life changes people, and perhaps he found in Madeline's family the approval or encouragement he felt he never quite received from me. Yet it hurt to watch the distance grow. Invitations to family gatherings became rarer, and when they did arrive, they felt like obligations rather than gestures of affection. I would show up, sit quietly, and listen to conversations that flowed around me as though I were invisible. They spoke of business deals, vacations in Europe, investments in properties I could never afford, and I realized more and more that in their eyes I was simply the old man in the corner, the relic of a generation they no longer cared to understand. Still, despite the growing alienation, I clung to hope that my son would one day recognize the depth of what this house meant, that he would understand that it was not simply real estate, not just a structure with a market value, but a lifeline of memory and meaning. Every time he visited, I would offer to show him the garden, to remind him of the tree he once climbed, to point out the scratch in the door frame where we had measured his height year after year. Sometimes he nodded politely, but most often he looked at his phone, distracted, eager to leave. It was then that I began to suspect, though I forced myself to ignore it, that he did not truly value this place as I did. Perhaps to him it was nothing more than a piece of property, a thing that could be traded, sold, or gifted away without consequence. That thought chilled me, yet I buried it deep, convincing myself that no son would ever betray the sacrifices of his father. Now I live here alone, surrounded by the whisper of waves and the creak of old walls, trying to maintain what we built as if it were still full of life. The neighbors change every few years, vacation houses are bought and sold, but mine remains constant. I mow the lawn myself. Though my knees ache, I polish the wooden railings, though my hands tremble, and I keep the veranda swept, though few ever step onto it anymore. Sometimes tourists passing by mistake me for a caretaker rather than the owner. And in truth, perhaps that is what I have become. The caretaker of a dream that no one else remembers. And yet I still tell myself that this house is not wasted. That one day my son will see it as I do. That he will recognize it not only as a structure of walls and windows, but as the heart of his family's history, as the anchor that kept us through decades of storms. I want to believe he will cherish it, that when I am gone, he will walk through these rooms with reverence rather than indifference. But deep down, I have begun to fear that the opposite may be true, that he is already looking at this place not with love, but with calculation. And if that is so, then the betrayal will not be a sudden wound, but a slow, festering cut that has been waiting in silence for years. It was a humid Thursday evening in late spring when the phone rang, and for a moment I almost did not answer it, thinking it was another telemarketer or one of those endless calls about medical insurance that always seemed to come at dinner time. But when I lifted the receiver and heard Daniel's voice, I felt a small jolt of warmth that I had not felt in a long while. He rarely called me directly anymore. Usually it was a quick text message or a relayed word through Madeline, so the sound of his voice carried with it the suggestion that something important was about to be said. He asked how I was doing, whether I had eaten, how the garden was coming along. Questions that might have seemed casual if not for the strange tone in his voice, a mixture of forced brightness and underlying hesitation, as if he were rehearsing lines. In a play, after a few minutes of polite conversation, he said that he and Madeline wanted to host a family dinner at my villa that coming weekend, that they thought it would be nice for everyone to gather under the same roof and spend some time together. The words themselves should have brought me joy. It had been so long since Daniel had suggested anything resembling family closeness, and for a fleeting moment I allowed myself to imagine the warmth of old times returning, the long table set with food, the sound of laughter drifting across the veranda, perhaps even the possibility that my son was finally beginning to remember the value of this house and the history it carried. I asked him who would be coming, whether it would be just the two of them, or whether the grandchildren, who seemed to be drifting further and further into their own busy lives, might also appear. Daniel's answer was evasive. He said simply that it would be a special gathering, that I should not worry about the details, that he and Madeline would take care of everything. I pressed him once more, but he gently changed the subject, asking instead whether the dining room was still large enough to seat 12, as if he had already counted the number of guests in his mind. 12, I thought to myself after we hung up. Who could they possibly be bringing? The days leading up to the dinner were filled with an odd combination of anticipation and unease. I busied myself with preparations, polishing the wooden table until it gleamed, airing out the curtains, mowing the lawn with a stubborn determination that left my back aching. Each chore became a way of convincing myself that this was not just another gathering, but perhaps the beginning of something better, a reconciliation of sorts, a chance for my son to come back to me not as a polite stranger, but as the boy I once raised. Yet beneath that fragile hope, another voice whispered darker possibilities, asking why Daniel had chosen now, after so many months of distance, to make such an effort. Hope is a dangerous thing at my age, because it clings to the smallest gestures and inflates them until disappointment becomes unbearable. Still, I worked as if the house itself needed to be reminded that it was still alive, still worthy of being filled with voices. On the evening of the dinner, the sky was heavy with clouds that threatened rain, though the air was warm enough to keep the doors and windows open. I had put on my best suit, the one Anna always said made me look taller, though it now hung a little loose around my shoulders. When I heard the sound of cars pulling into the driveway, I straightened the silverware on the table and took a deep breath, telling myself that this was a moment to be cherished. But as soon as I opened the door, the first flicker of unease crept back into me. Daniel and Madeline were not alone. Behind them came her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Aldridge, a pair I had always regarded with polite distance, for though they were outwardly charming, there was a sharpness in their eyes, a kind of hunger that unsettled me. Following them was her younger brother, a man I had met only once before at the wedding, and behind him another couple I did not recognize, but who greeted me with the kind of practiced smiles that belong to business acquaintances rather than family. Madeline took my arm with exaggerated affection, calling me Dad, in a tone that felt more rehearsed than sincere, and guided me toward the living room where more guests were already gathering, guests I had never seen before, laughing too loudly and inspecting the rooms as though they were visiting a property for sale. The realization hit me slowly but heavily. This was not a family dinner in the way I had imagined. This was something else entirely. A performance, a stage set for an audience that had little to do with me. Daniel moved about the room in a host's role, introducing people, making small jokes, speaking with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He looked comfortable, almost proud, as if he were showing off not only his wife and her family, but also the house itself. My house, as though it belonged to him already. I stood for a long time in the corner, smiling faintly when addressed, shaking hands when necessary, but feeling the ground beneath me shift with every passing minute. My villa, which had always been a sanctuary of memory and quiet, had suddenly become a showroom. The Aldridges walked through the hallways with the air of inspectors, complimenting the architecture in tones that suggested appraisal rather than admiration. Their son leaned against the doorframe of the study, flipping through one of my old photo albums without asking, remarking casually about how quaint the old pictures looked. I wanted to snatch it from his hands, to remind him that these were not curiosities, but the fragile remains of my life. Yet I said nothing, paralyzed by the growing suspicion that whatever was happening here was deliberate, and that my son was at the center of it. When we finally sat down at the table, the mood should have been festive, but for me it was drenched in unease. The conversations flowed easily among the others, mostly about investments, property values, the rising cost of coastal real estate, all topics that seemed strangely pointed in the context of where we were sitting. Daniel raised his glass at one point and began to speak about the importance of family, about the strength of building a legacy together, words that on the surface sounded admirable, but which carried beneath them an undertone I could not quite place, as though he were rehearsing a justification rather than a celebration. Madeline beamed at him proudly, her parents nodded approvingly, and I felt myself shrinking into my chair, suddenly an outsider at my own table. The food tasted like ash in my mouth, though I had prepared some of it myself earlier that day. Each compliment from the Aldridges about the beauty of the house landed like a small cut, because I could see in their eyes that they were already imagining it as theirs, already staking silent claims. My son's words, his glances, his way of steering the conversation, all seemed to be guiding us toward some revelation that I dreaded to hear, but could no longer deny was coming. The villa was no longer being treated as the backdrop to a family memory. It was being treated as an object of desire, a prize on the table waiting to be claimed. And though no one said it outright that night, I could feel it pressing down on me with the weight of inevitability. Something was about to change, something that would strip away the last illusion I had been clinging to about my son, my family, and the sanctuary of the life I had built. The night of the dinner lingered with me long after the guests had gone, not because of any warmth it had provided, but because of the way every smile, every compliment, every casual remark had seemed to carry a hidden blade. When the last car finally pulled out of the driveway and the sound of tires on gravel faded into silence, I stood in the hallway, staring at the door, feeling as though I had just witnessed something staged rather than lived. The villa was unusually still, almost resentful, as though it too had felt invaded by strangers who did not belong within its walls. I wandered through the rooms, noticing small details I had never thought about before. The way Madeline's father had tapped his fingers on the mantelpiece as if assessing the wood. The way her mother had quietly examined the view from the veranda as, though calculating its value, the way Daniel had spoken with an ease that belonged not to a guest in my home, but to a man who believed himself the rightful master. It was not one thing, but 1,000 small impressions that together began to weave a net of unease around me, a net I could no longer ignore. The following week, Daniel returned, this time without the entourage of in-laws and acquaintances, though Madeline accompanied him. They arrived in the afternoon, unannounced, which already felt unusual, and as I opened the door, I noticed the expression on my son's face. Not the wary distance I had grown used to, but a new confidence, a kind of authority that seemed borrowed from another man. He did not ask to come in. He stepped inside as though the house had already shifted in his mind into his possession. Madeline followed behind him, her perfume lingering in the air, her eyes scanning the hallway, not with nostalgia but with assessment, as if she were walking through a showroom. They settled in the living room, Daniel on the sofa where he had once sprawled as a boy with comic books, Madeline with her legs crossed elegantly, her voice carrying the calm control of someone who already knew the outcome of the conversation they were about to have. Daniel began by speaking of practicalities, about how much upkeep the villa required, how difficult it must be for me at my age to manage such a large property, how lonely it must feel to rattle around in these spacious rooms with no family living in. There are many more. He framed his words as concern, but there was a sharp edge beneath the softness, a rehearsed rhythm that told me this was not a spontaneous conversation, but something planned, prepared, perhaps even rehearsed with Madeline and her family. I listened in silence, letting him speak, though each sentence felt like a tightening of a vice around my chest. He spoke of opportunity, of how real estate prices along the coast had risen, of how it was almost irresponsible not to make use of such value when younger generations could benefit. He used phrases like legacy planning and long-term family security. But the more he spoke, the clearer it became that what he was really saying was that I no longer fit into the picture, that my presence in this villa was an inconvenience, an obstacle to be delicately but firmly removed. When I finally asked him outright what he was suggesting, he leaned back in his chair with the same air of confidence I had seen during the dinner and said, almost casually, that Madeline's parents had expressed an interest in the villa, that it would make sense for them to be its caretakers since they were younger, more active, and capable of maintaining it properly. I stared at him, trying to process the words, unable to believe I was hearing them correctly. My son, the boy I had raised in these rooms, was calmly proposing to hand my life's work, my sanctuary, to his in-laws as though it were a logical, almost inevitable decision. He smiled faintly, as though expecting me to see the sense in it, as though I should thank him for such foresight. My hands trembled, and I clasped them together tightly to hide it, but inside me something cracked, a fissure that would not close again. Madeline joined in then, her voice smooth, her reasoning polished. She said that her parents adored the villa, that they had always admired its architecture, that they would be willing to take on the financial burden of repairs and taxes, relieving me of what she called unnecessary stress. She spoke as if she were offering me a kindness, as if I should be grateful for being relieved of the weight of my own home. But behind the words I could hear the calculation, the eagerness disguised as generosity. When I asked where I was supposed to go in this plan, Daniel waved the question aside with a dismissive tone that stung more deeply than any insult. He said there were plenty of comfortable retirement communities nearby, places where I would have companionship, medical support, activities to fill my days. He painted the picture of an old man shuffling through bingo nights and supervised outings, as though that were all I was now, as though my identity could be reduced to someone waiting to be entertained until death arrived. The conversation did not end there. It stretched over hours, circling the same points again and again, each time with a little less pretense, a little less patience. Daniel grew sharper, his words more direct, his arguments framed less as concern and more as inevitability. He told me I had to think realistically, that I could not expect to cling forever to a property too large for me, that it was time to be rational rather than sentimental. He spoke of responsibility, of how he had a duty to provide for his wife's family as well as his own, and that this villa, standing here with its expensive upkeep and wasted potential, was the logical answer. Each time he said logical, I wanted to shout that there was nothing logical about erasing the very heart of one's family history, Nothing logical about replacing love with convenience. Nothing logical about treating a father's home as a bargaining chip. But the words lodged in my throat, strangled by the disbelief that my own son could stand before me and speak in this way. When they finally left that evening, I stood at the window watching them walk down the path, Madeline's hand resting on Daniel's arm, in a gesture that looked less like affection and more like control. The villa around me felt suddenly smaller, as though the walls themselves had drawn inward in shame. I wandered through the rooms, touching the furniture, the photographs, the worn edges of the door frames, all the details that carried decades of memory, and for the first time I felt the sharp intrusion of fear. Fear that these things, these tangible remnants of my life, could be stripped from me not by strangers, not by chance, but by the very son I had once believed would protect them after I was gone. That night I could not sleep. I sat in the living room with the lights off, staring at the dark outline of the sea through the windows, listening to the restless waves that seemed to echo the turmoil inside me. Every sound of the house settling in the night felt like a whisper of betrayal, every creak of the wooden beams like a warning that the foundation of my life was beginning to fracture. Over the next days, the unease only deepened. Daniel's calls grew more frequent, but not warmer. He would ring to ask if I had thought about what we discussed, whether I had looked into retirement options, whether I had considered how much easier life could be if I let go of the burdens of the villa. He spoke as if my agreement were already certain, as if my consent were a formality rather than a choice. I noticed that Madeleine's parents began appearing more often in the neighborhood, stopping by casually, asking if they might look around the garden again, commenting on how beautiful the sea view was from the upstairs windows. Their presence was suffocating, an ever-present reminder that they were circling, waiting, ready to swoop in the moment I faltered. Even the neighbors began to remark on how often the Aldridges seemed to be at my home, their curiosity tinged with the assumption that something was changing. And through it all, I carried the growing dread that what had once been unthinkable was already becoming real, that my son had already made up his mind, and that I was no longer regarded as the owner of this villa, but as an obstacle to be gently pushed aside. The moment of rupture came not in private, as I had half expected, but in the most humiliating way possible, in front of a room full of witnesses who had no right to be involved in the fate of my life's work. Daniel called again a week later and invited me to another gathering, saying that Madeline's parents wanted to host a celebration of family unity. His tone was brisk, decisive, leaving me no space to object, and though my instincts screamed against it, I felt cornered, as if refusing would only confirm in their minds that I was an obstacle, a stubborn relic clinging to what no longer belonged to me. Against my better judgment, I agreed, telling myself that perhaps there was still a chance to reason with him, to remind him of what this house truly meant. The day of the gathering was warm, the air filled with the heavy scent of salt and the distant cries of gulls. When I entered the dining room, I immediately understood that this was not a simple family dinner, but a carefully orchestrated event. The long table was set as though for a formal banquet, with silverware gleaming under the chandelier and expensive wine bottles lined up as if to impress rather than to enjoy. Around the table sat not only Daniel and Madeline and her parents, but also their friends, neighbors of theirs whom I scarcely knew, and two men in suits who looked distinctly like lawyers. I felt my stomach tighten at the sight of them, and for a moment I nearly turned and walked out. But Daniel greeted me with a broad smile, pulling me in and introducing me to everyone as though I were a guest in someone else's house. The dinner itself was a blur. I remember the clinking of glasses, the laughter of people who had no attachment to the villa other than what it represented as a possession, the hollow compliments about the architecture and the view, all spoken in tones that made it clear they were. Appraising rather than admiring, I sat in silence for much of it, trying to steady my breathing, telling myself that perhaps this was only another performance, another attempt to pressure me into agreeing to some arrangement, but that nothing final could be decided without my consent. Yet beneath that fragile reassurance, dread coiled tighter with every passing moment, especially when I noticed the stack of folders near one of the suited men's chairs, as though legal matters were waiting to be presented. It was after the main course, when the conversation had lulled into a forced sort of cheerfulness, that Daniel rose to his feet and tapped his glass. The room grew quiet, expectant, and I felt every eye shift toward him. He began by speaking of gratitude, thanking everyone for coming, thanking Madeline's parents for their generosity and support, speaking of how blessed he felt to have such a united family. His words flowed smoothly, practiced, carrying the tone of a man delivering not just a toast, but an announcement. And then he turned toward me, his voice softening into a tone that pretended to be affectionate, but landed like a dagger. He said that it was time to acknowledge reality, that the villa had served its purpose as the cradle of our family's history, but that it was too much for one man to maintain, and that, after careful thought, he had decided it was best to place it in the hands of those who could preserve it for generations to come. He extended his hand toward Madeline's parents and declared, with a calmness that froze me to my core, that the villa now belonged to them, that from this day forward they would be the caretakers and rightful residents. For a long moment I could not move. The words seemed to hang in the air like a heavy fog, and though my mind screamed at me to protest, to demand an explanation, my voice would not come. The room erupted in applause, glasses clinked, Madeline's parents smiled with the serene triumph of victors who had already anticipated their prize. The two men in suits nodded and shuffled papers as though everything were in order, as though my son's declaration had the force of law. I stared at Daniel, my own flesh and blood, standing there so confident, so certain, so blind to the enormity of what he was doing, and I felt a wave of humiliation wash over me that was almost unbearable. I was not only being robbed, but robbed publicly, stripped of dignity in front of strangers, reduced to a bystander in the destruction of my own legacy. When I finally managed to speak, my voice shook, not from weakness but from the fury I struggled to contain. I asked him what he meant, how he could stand there and say such things when the villa was still legally mine, when no transfer had been discussed, no papers signed. He looked at me with that same infuriating calmness and said that everything had already been taken care of, that I need not trouble myself with the details. He said I should think of it as a gift, an act of generosity on my part, a way of securing harmony between families. The words burned as though he had branded me with them, because they carried not only betrayal, but the implication that I had somehow agreed to this, that I was complicit in my own erasure. I felt the eyes of everyone at the table on me, waiting for me to protest, perhaps even enjoying the spectacle of the old man being cornered. I pushed back from the table, my chair scraping against the floor with a sound that cut through the chatter, and I stood trembling, my hands clenched at my sides. I told him he had no right, that he could not simply declare my house to belong to someone else, as if words alone could dissolve decades of sacrifice and memory. But my protest sounded small against the tide of his confidence and the approving murmurs of those around him. Madeline rose then, taking his hand, smiling serenely, and told me that I needed to trust them, that they were only doing what was best for me, that in time I would thank them for freeing me from the burden of responsibility. Her words, smooth as silk, were a poison I could not swallow. I looked at the people around me, these strangers who applauded as though they had witnessed a noble gesture, and I realized with a sinking heart that in their eyes I was already defeated, an old man clinging to what was no longer his, a figure to be pitied rather than respected. I left the table without another word, retreating to the veranda where the sea air struck me cold and sharp. Behind me the laughter resumed, muffled by the glass doors, as though nothing had happened, as though my world had not just been torn apart. I gripped the railing so tightly my knuckles whitened, staring at the horizon where the sun was sinking into the water. And for the first time in my life, I felt not only betrayed, but erased, as though my existence, my labor, my very love had been rewritten in an instant by the son I had trusted most. In the days that followed Daniel's declaration, I moved through the villa as though wandering through the ruins of a city after an invasion, every room tainted by the echo of applause that had accompanied his betrayal. I could not pass the dining room without hearing again the clink of glasses, the hollow congratulations, the sound of my son's voice announcing with certainty that the house no longer belonged to me. Even in the silence of the night, when the surf outside was the only sound in the world, I would wake in a cold sweat, convinced that footsteps were moving through the halls, the voices of strangers claiming each space as their own. It was not paranoia, for soon enough the intrusion became real. Within days, Madeline's parents began appearing as though they had already assumed ownership, arriving with contractors and surveyors, walking through the villa with clipboards and tape measures, pointing out places where they might renovate, repaint, restructure. They moved with the assurance of people who believed the property was theirs, nodding politely to me when we crossed paths, speaking to me not as the master of the house, but as if I were a caretaker, a relic who had been allowed to linger for a while. Out of courtesy, I confronted Daniel when he came again, this time with one of those suited men I had seen at the dinner. They spread papers across the coffee table, documents filled with legal jargon, signatures already placed where mine should have been. I demanded to know how they had obtained them, how anyone could claim that a transfer had been completed without my consent. Daniel's expression was infuriatingly calm, as if he were speaking to a child who had failed to understand a simple truth. He said that my consent was not necessary because I had already given it, that the paperwork had been signed weeks earlier when I had allegedly agreed to the arrangement. At first I was too stunned to speak, but when I managed to glance at the documents, I saw my own signature scrawled at the bottom of the page, though I knew with the certainty of my own hand that I had never signed it. My heart pounded with a fury that left me trembling. Someone had forged my name, someone had dared to replicate the last mark of my will, and my son stood there, not only condoning it, but presenting it as fact. When I accused him of forgery, his calm slipped into irritation. He told me that perhaps I had forgotten, that at my age it was common to lose track of what one had signed. He reminded me of the evening weeks earlier when he had placed a stack of papers before me, supposedly regarding insurance adjustments, and asked me to initial them. I remembered it now with horrifying clarity. The way he had insisted it was nothing important, just routine, the way I had signed without reading because he was my son, and because trust had always been my instinct when it came to him. I felt the weight of that mistake pressing down on me, the bitter realization that the deception had begun long before the dinner, that I had been maneuvered step by step toward this very moment. Madeline entered the room then, her smile as polished as ever, her words dripping with the false sweetness of someone who has already won. She said they were only thinking of my well-being, that the transfer would protect me from the burdens of taxes and maintenance, that I should be grateful for their foresight. I told her she and her family had manipulated Daniel, twisted his sense of loyalty, poisoned his view of what family should mean. She laughed softly, shaking her head, and said that Daniel was finally growing into the man he was meant to be, a man who put the needs of his own family, her family, above outdated sentimentality. The words struck me harder than a slap, for in them was the truth I had feared. that in his heart Daniel no longer considered me his true family, that I had been replaced, erased, supplanted by people who had done nothing to build this villa but who now walked its floors as conquerors. The days blurred into a series of humiliations. Contractors came and went without asking my permission, tearing up pieces of the garden Anna had planted, discussing plans to repaint walls that had held our photographs for decades. One afternoon I found Madeline's mother in Anna's old sewing room, opening drawers and remarking how useful the space would be as a home office. I stood frozen in the doorway, the rage boiling inside me, yet she looked up with a smile as though nothing were amiss, as though I should be pleased to see the room repurposed. On another day, I overheard Madeline's father speaking on the phone about the potential rental income the villa could generate if the old man were moved out quickly enough. And though I wanted to storm in and demand he show respect, the words lodged in my throat like stones. I had become a ghost in my own home, a silent presence drifting through corridors where decisions were being made about my future as though I no longer existed. But the deepest wound came not from the Aldridges but from Daniel himself. One evening he sat across from me in the living room, the same room where I had once read him stories as a child, and told me in a voice that was firm, almost rehearsed, that I should not fight what was happening. He said that I had done enough in my life, that it was time to let go, that clinging to the villa was selfish when others could use it better. He said that Anna would have wanted harmony, that she would not have approved of me causing conflict over property. At that moment I felt the air leave my lungs, because he had invoked her name, twisting the memory of the woman I had loved and cared for into a weapon against me. I wanted to shout that Anna had poured her soul into this villa, that she had planted every flower, chosen every curtain, cooked every meal in the kitchen with joy, because she believed this house was the heart of our family. To suggest that she would approve of it being handed to strangers was not only a lie, but an abomination. Yet Daniel looked at me with eyes that were cold, determined, and I realized with terrible clarity that he believed his own words, that he had convinced himself this betrayal was justified, even noble. The cruelty did not stop there. Soon whispers began to reach me from the community, subtle remarks from neighbors who hinted that Daniel and Madeline had spoken of my health declining, of my mind not being what it once was, of their need to step in to protect me from my own. Confusion. I saw the looks in people's eyes when they spoke to me, the hesitation, the pity, as though they were already half convinced that I was slipping into dementia. When I confronted Daniel, he did not deny it. He told me bluntly that people needed to believe I was no longer capable of managing my affairs, that it was the only way to make the transfer appear legitimate, that I should accept it for my own good. He used my age as a weapon, my vulnerability as a justification, turning the very years I had lived into evidence against me. I felt stripped bare, not only of my home but of my dignity, reduced to a caricature of an old man whose words could be dismissed as confusion. At night I sat in Anna's old chair by the window, staring out at the restless sea, trying to piece together how everything had unraveled so quickly. I thought of the boy Daniel had once been, the boy who had run laughing across the beach, who had clung to my hand during storms, who had told me he wanted to be strong like his father. Where had that boy gone? How had he become this man who could stand before me and justify betrayal with the language of responsibility and logic? I wondered whether it had been Madeline's influence alone, or whether something in him had always been waiting for this chance, something cold, something calculating. The questions gnawed at me, but the answers were too painful to face. The escalation reached its sharpest point when I discovered the truth about Madeline's parents. A neighbor, an old friend who had once been close with Anna, pulled me aside one morning and told me quietly that the Aldridges were not as stable as they appeared, that they were drowning in debts from failed business ventures, that they had been using every trick in the book to keep creditors at bay. The villa was not simply a desirable home to them, it was a lifeline, a fortress in which to hide their failures, a shield against the ruin they had brought upon themselves. Suddenly everything fell into place. Their eagerness, their confidence, their constant presence. They had manipulated Daniel, whispering of duty and legacy, until he convinced himself that handing them the villa was an act of honor rather than desperation. My son had not only betrayed me, he had been used, turned into a pawn in a scheme to cover another family's disgrace. When I confronted him with this, he erupted in anger, shouting that I was slandering his wife's parents, that I was grasping at lies to justify my stubbornness. He told me that I was poisoning the family with suspicion, that if I continued, he would be forced to take legal measures to have me declared incompetent. His threat hung in the air like a noose, and I realized then that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. The boy I had raised, the man I had hoped would one day protect this villa as his inheritance, was gone, replaced by someone who saw me not as father, but as an obstacle to be removed. The breaking point came on a sweltering afternoon, when the air inside the villa hung heavy with the smell of salt and dust, as if even the walls themselves were suffocating under the weight of what had been done to them. I had endured the endless parade of contractors, the cold efficiency of lawyers, the smug smiles of Madeline's parents, and the rehearsed justifications of my son. But something in me snapped when I discovered that Anna's sewing room had been emptied, the drawers stripped, her fabrics and needles packed into boxes as if they were nothing but clutter to be discarded. I stood in the doorway staring at the bare walls, at the faint outlines where her shelves had once been, and felt a surge of grief so violent it bordered on rage. In that moment I understood with blinding clarity that if I did nothing, Anna's memory would be erased piece by piece until there was nothing left of her in this house but dust and silence. That realization filled me with a strength I had thought long lost, a hard, cold determination that cut through the fog of humiliation and despair. I began quietly, methodically, reaching for the one thing I still had, the truth buried in the old documents Anna and I had signed together decades earlier. In the bottom drawer of the study desk, beneath piles of photographs and unpaid bills, I found the folder that had not been touched in years, brittle papers with fading ink, but still valid, still binding. Among them was the will Anna had drawn up before her illness worsened, the one she had insisted on despite my reluctance, because she wanted to ensure that the villa would never fall into the wrong hands. Reading it now, with the desperation of a man clinging to his last hope, I saw the clause she had insisted upon, that no transfer, sale, or reassignment of the villa could take place without my explicit consent as long as I lived. Her foresight, born of her quiet distrust even back then, now rose like a shield from the grave. My hands shook as I held the paper, but my heart surged with something I had not felt in months. Power, fragile but real, the power of a man who still had the law on his side. Armed with those documents, I went to see an attorney, an old acquaintance recommended by a neighbor who still respected me enough to believe my words over the whispers of decline. Sitting in his office, I spread out the forged papers Daniel had shown me alongside Anna's will, my voice trembling as I told the story from the beginning. The attorney listened carefully, his eyes narrowing as he examined the signatures, his expression hardening when he compared them. At last he looked up and said with quiet conviction that the forgery was obvious, that the documents Daniel claimed were binding would crumble under scrutiny, and that Anna's will was ironclad. He promised me that we could challenge everything, that the law had not abandoned me, that I was not powerless despite what my son wanted me to believe. The relief that flooded me was not joy, but a grim satisfaction, the satisfaction of a man who had been cornered and finally found a weapon with which to fight back. The next step came when I uncovered the truth about the Aldridges' debts in a way that could no longer be dismissed as rumor. Through the same attorney, I obtained records that revealed lawsuits, unpaid loans, failed business ventures covered with layers of deceit. The image of their respectability shattered on the page before me, exposing them not as the dignified family they pretended to be, but as parasites desperate to seize anything that might shield them from ruin. When I held those papers in my hands, I felt no triumph, only a grim confirmation of what I had known in my gut from the beginning, that they had ensnared Daniel, feeding his pride and sense of responsibility until he believed that giving them the villa was a noble sacrifice rather than the betrayal it truly was. Now, with their lies laid bare, I had more than grief and anger. I had evidence, hard and undeniable. The confrontation could no longer be postponed. It happened in the villa itself, because I refused to cede the battlefield of my own home. Daniel and Madeline arrived with her parents, as though ready to finalize their conquest, and I was waiting with the attorney by my side, the documents spread across the table like weapons prepared for war. Daniel's expression shifted when he saw the folder, a flicker of doubt breaking through his confidence, but he quickly masked it with irritation, accusing me of dragging outsiders into family matters. I told him calmly, with a steadiness I had not felt in months, that this was no longer a private dispute, but a matter of fraud, forgery, and theft. I laid out Anna's will, reading aloud the clause that made their so-called transfer invalid, and then I presented the proof of the Aldridges' debts, watching the color drain from their faces as their facade cracked. My voice rose as I told them that this villa was not theirs to claim, not his to give, and that no amount of manipulation or false signatures could change the truth that Anna and I had built into these walls. The room erupted with protest, Madeline's voice sharp with outrage, her parents sputtering excuses, Daniel shouting that I was tearing the family apart. But beneath their noise, I felt the power of my words settle like stones, undeniable and immovable. The attorney's presence silenced their confidence further, his calm explanation of the legal consequences cutting through their bluster with the precision of a blade. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw fear in their eyes, the dawning realization that their scheme was collapsing. Daniel tried to appeal to me then, his voice breaking, accusing me of destroying everything out of stubbornness. But I cut him off with a clarity that stunned even myself. I told him that he had destroyed it the moment he chose betrayal over loyalty, lies over love, greed over the memory of his mother. I told him that he had forced me into this battle and that I would not yield, not even if it meant standing alone for the rest of my life. The climax was not a single moment of triumph, but a storm of words, accusations, and revelations, each one stripping away the illusions until only the raw truth remained. By the time they stormed out of the villa, leaving behind their threats and bitterness, the silence that settled over the house was not the silence of defeat, but the silence of survival. I stood in the center of the living room, the papers still spread before me, and felt the weight of Anna's foresight pressing against me like a hand from beyond the grave. She had given me the weapon I needed, and I had wielded it, not out of vengeance, but out of love for the life we had built. I was exhausted, trembling, but inside me there was a core of steel that had not been there before. The villa was still mine, and though the war was not yet over, the battle had been won. When the storm of confrontation finally passed, what remained was not triumph, but a strange, aching quiet, the kind of silence that settles after a hurricane has torn through and left everything standing yet irreversibly changed. Daniel and Madeline no longer came to the villa, and the Aldridges vanished from the neighborhood, as if retreating into the shadows of their debts and schemes. For a time, I expected Daniel to return, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to try once more to bend me to his will, but the days stretched into weeks, and his absence became its own answer. I realized that he had chosen his side, not with hesitation, but with finality, and that I had to live with the truth that my only son had turned away from me. That knowledge cut deeper than any legal battle or public humiliation, for it was not merely the loss of a relationship, but the death of an illusion I had clung to for years. The illusion that no matter how distant he became, he would always return to the values I had tried to instill in him. The villa stood unchanged on the surface, the walls still holding the same photographs, the garden still catching the same sea breeze, but I saw it differently now. Where once it had been a sanctuary filled with echoes of warmth and laughter, it now bore the scars of intrusion, the memory of strangers walking through its rooms with ownership in their eyes, the betrayal of my son's voice echoing in its halls. Yet with time, I began to see that it was not ruined but tested, and that in surviving the assault it had become something even stronger. It was no longer just the home Anna and I had built. It was the last bastion of my dignity, the place where I had chosen to stand rather than surrender, the proof that even when everything else was stripped away, I had refused to let go of the truth. Neighbors whispered about what had happened, fragments of the story carried from one house to another, until people began looking at me differently. Some with pity, some with admiration, some with unease, as though they did not know whether to treat me as a victim or a victor. I did not correct their assumptions. I simply carried on, mowing the lawn, tending the garden, sitting on the veranda at dusk with the sea stretching out before me. Life had become quieter, lonelier, yet in that loneliness there was also clarity. I no longer waited for Daniel to visit, no longer imagined reconciliation just around the corner. I accepted that he had made his choice, and in that acceptance came a grim peace. I could not control his heart, but I could control my own, and I chose not to let bitterness consume what years I had left. There are moments, especially at night, when I feel the weight of what has been lost pressing heavily against me. I see Daniel's face as a boy, running barefoot across the sand, his laughter rising above the waves, and I wonder how that child became the man who stood before me with forged papers and cold eyes. I replay conversations, searching for the moment when the fracture began, when his loyalty shifted away from blood to the allure of another family's influence. The questions have no answers, but they no longer torment me as they once did. They are simply part of the story now, threads woven into the larger fabric of a life that has been marked by both love and betrayal. What sustains me in the end is not anger, but memory. The memory of Anna's hand in mine, of her foresight that saved me from ruin, of her voice reminding me that the house we built was not only walls and windows, but the embodiment of our lives. I sometimes imagine her watching from the veranda as I sit in the evening light, her presence lingering in the whisper of the waves and the rustle of the palm leaves. I tell her silently that I kept my promise, that I defended what was ours, that I did not let it be stolen while I still had breath. In those moments I feel less alone, as if the villa itself is speaking back to me, affirming that it remembers too. The future is uncertain. I know that time is not on my side, that the years ahead will not be many, but I no longer fear them. The villa will outlast me, as I always intended, and what happens to it after I am gone is beyond my control. Perhaps Daniel will inherit it and sell it. Perhaps he will give it away as he once tried to do. Perhaps it will fall to strangers who see it only as an investment. But none of that can erase the truth of what it was while I lived, the truth that I stood my ground and preserved it in the face of betrayal. That is enough for me. I may die alone, but I will not die stripped of dignity, and in the end that is the victory that matters most.